in the Greek language, they have two words to describe time. In South Africa, we have also a few words to describe time. We have like just now and now, and we all know what that means, but people from other countries don't know the difference between just now or now, but we know. And the Greeks also had different words to describe time. The one word is chronos, and the other word is kairos. And chronos is like the measurement of time. That's the hours and the minutes. Kairos is when something happens. This is the moment. It's a moment for opportunity. It's the moment for action. So if you think back to school, some of you are still in school. Chronos is when you're in the lesson waiting for the bell to ring. And the seconds are going really slowly, and you're watching the clock as the second hand is going, and you know the bell's going to ring soon. That's chronos. You're waiting. And kairos is the moment when the bell goes and you can go out to the playground for break. Chronos is the moment when you're sitting in the doctor's waiting rooms for an appointment, and you're anticipating what the doctor's going to share with you. And kairos is the moment when the doctor gives his report, good or bad. And that kairos moment can be something that's life-changing for you. It could be really good news, or it could be really bad news. Chronos is the moment before your alarm goes off in the morning, when you're fast asleep. And we used to use those old alarm clocks with bells on the top, but now everyone uses their phones, and when they oversleep, it's like, no, it was the Apple software upgrade. I know my alarm just didn't go off. That's the chronos moment while it's counting down to your alarm. But the kairos moment is when your alarm goes off, and there's a change that happens, and you go from being asleep to being awake. That's kairos. Something has shifted. Something has changed. And then a lot of us hit the snooze button. We go back into chronos, and we miss the moment of waking up. And we snooze and snooze and snooze again until eventually we kairos and get out of bed. Chronos is the moment when you sit here in church and you go, how long is this going to take? I've got things to do. And kairos is the moment when God comes crashing into your world and speaks to you and gives you revelation, and you leave this place different to the way that you walked in. And we believe that this season is a kairos season. It's not just the clickety-click of time, but if we will pay attention, it's a kairos moment where God comes into our lives. He intersects the journey of our chronos and brings a kairos moment, and it changes everything. Our perspective, it shifts everything. This is a kairos moment. If we will open our eyes and pay attention, not hit the snooze button and go back to sleep and get back into chronos. We started last week in John 4, and Chantal, I'm so grateful that you were one of the people who went home and read John 4. I trust that some others of you did the same. If you haven't yet, it's not too late. You can get yourself a Bible if you haven't got one. We can get one for you if you don't have one. You open it up. You look for John. There's a few Johns in there. You don't go to 1 John, but you go to the 1 John in the Bible. Churchy joke. You'll figure it out. And you go to John chapter 4, and you begin to read, and we see this incredible story, and this chapter is full of kairos. It's actually got chronos in too, because the story about Jesus, how he goes out of his way, out of the cultural ways, into a land called Samaria, where no Jewish person in their right mind would go, but Jesus goes into this place, and he gets there at 12 o'clock, chronos, 12 midday. He goes to a well to draw water, and he meets there this social outcast, this Samaritan woman who's there because she's avoiding everybody else, because no one goes to a well in the middle of the day. And Jesus goes to this place and meets her at a chronos moment, and then they have this kairos conversation where this social outcast is given a story about Jesus that she takes back into the very city that she's running from and hiding from, and leads to the whole city becoming saved. She takes a person who is racked by shame and gives them a testimony that unlocks a city. It's a kairos moment. Her life is never going to be the same because of one conversation with Jesus. And I believe the same is true for you. When you have an encounter, a conversation for Jesus, those are not chronos moments. Whenever you interact with Jesus, it's always a kairos moment. It always shifts something. It always changes something if you're receptive to what it is that he wants to do in your heart. But this conversation that Jesus has with this woman is not the only thing. It's not the only kairos moment in the story. Actually, in between the outworking of this story, there's something else that Jesus says that if you don't open your eyes, you miss what he's actually saying. This is a kairos moment that literally changed the course of how worship was done, if we will pay attention. It's kind of this subtle conversation. The woman almost uses it as an evasion tactic to get Jesus off the focus on her and starts a conversation about worship. Now, how many of us know it's not always a good idea to engage Jesus in a debate? And we see this play out in the story, and then the story kind of carries on, and she goes on and shares her testimony with the city, and they all get saved. And if we're not careful, we miss this part about worship. So after last week, I said we're going to spend a bit of time in this chapter, and we're going to dig into this idea of worship, because what Jesus says here, it's kind of like this. Okay, Jesus, time out. Hold on. Did you really say what you just said? Because that shifts everything. And this is a moment where everything changed. And often we read John 4 and we believe it's a story, and it is the story about how a person's life is changed. But really what Jesus did and said here changes the reality of faith for you and I. And it has an incredible impact on how we see God and how we interact with Him if we will pay attention. So as we begin this conversation about worship, I would love to hear from you. What is worship? This is the part where you speak. Love to hear any ideas. What would you say worship is? No wrong answers. You don't have to put up hands. Just shout out answers. What do you think? Loudly. Singing. Attitude. Adoration. Working. Reverence. Sleeping. Wow. Anyone else? Kairos moments. Desires of our hearts. Deep. Wow. Being with God. These are all great. What do you think the Bible says about worship? It says a lot about worship. If you look at when worship is first mentioned, it's a story of sacrifice. And then we read through the Psalms and we see incredible poetic language about worship and a heart attitude, a posture towards God. Jesus teaches about worship. We're going to look at that some of that today. Paul writes about worship. There's a lot in the Bible about worship. And we get the idea God is pretty particular about worship. But what you don't find in the Bible is a definition of what worship is. There's no like sentence or verse and chapter you can go to and say, like, this is worship. You can look at what the words mean. You can look at the stories and where it's told and get an idea of worship is. But there's no like place where you can go and say, this is worship. So what we need to do to understand a biblical perspective of worship is kind of take these ideas and sum them up into a couple of definitions. So here's two from people who are way cleverer than me when it comes to worship. One called Tom Inglis, he said, worship is a constant consciousness of God and a continuous response to that. Worship is a constant awareness that God is here, that He's around, and it's a continuous, not a momentary, but a continuous response to the presence of God. It's this idea that God is here, and how am I responding to that? That's worship. Another one, and we'll come back to these definitions, Judson Cornwall said, it's an attitude of heart. Someone here said attitude. It's a reaching towards God. It's a pouring out of our total self in thanksgiving and praise and adoration and love to God. Something of a heart attitude. It's an awareness of God, and it's an attitude towards God. This is what worship is not. Worship is not our slow songs on Sunday. That's an expression of worship. It's one of the ways that we express worship, but that is not worship. In fact, you can worship without music. What? You can. That's a relief for so many of us, because some of us are like, well, I really cannot sing well. You don't have to be on the band to worship. In fact, we don't even need a band. Sorry, band. We don't even need a band to worship. You know, I was thinking about this term worship leader as preparing for this. Well, I think we should rename that worship leader to something else. Like perhaps it's the leader of a team who leads us in an expression of worship. I don't know, that's a bit of a mouthful. Maybe we can come up with an acronym or something. But because of our language and the ideas that we have, many of us grown up in church, and we see that's the worship team, that's the worship leader, that's what worship is. Worship is singing songs on a Sunday. That's not what worship is. Worship is, in that sense, an expression of what true worship is. It's an action that reflects an attitude. And the thing about worship is that you were created to worship. And you are very good at worship. If you've ever thought, I'm not good at worship, think again. The world is full of worshipers, and people are very, very good at worship. We worship all kinds of things. We have fans and fanatics and pop idols and everything where we pay attention, give attention to, speaks of worship, and people are created to worship by a creator. That's what we believe. So the question is not, do you worship? The question is rather, who or what and how do you worship? You worship. You just may not have realized that yet. Just because you're not on the band doesn't mean that you're not a worshiper. You are inherently created by God to be a worshiper. So a better definition of worship is, if we look at where the word comes from, to worship means to give worth to something. It's an Anglo-Saxon term that means worth-ship. It's where you put your worth. Your worship, your object of your worship is the things that you pay attention to. It's your priorities. The thing that you worship, or the person that you worship, is the one that you give value to. It's the one that you esteem. It's the one that you invest in. Think of it this way. If you want to know what you worship, think of the area of your life where you are not stingy. Whatever it is for you that you are not stingy in with your resources, your time, your stuff, that is an area of worship. And if you follow the trail of your time, your money, and your activities, that will lead you to your thrones of worship and who sits on them. When you look at where your resources go and where they lead, that will reveal the object of your worship. This is what worship is. And suddenly we see worship in a whole different light. Well, I thought worship was just singing, that slow song. Song number 4 on Sunday. That's worship. That's it. When the lights dim and the haze is on, and, it's that moment when the worship leader's like, this is the moment. That's worship. No, that's an expression of worship. The object of your worship is really what you value, what you invest, where you are not stingy. I love that definition. Your behavior will reveal the object of your worship. So if you ever want to know what it is that you worship or who it is that you worship, take an analysis, reflect on your behavior and your actions, and that will reveal what it is or who it is that you worship. And the thing about worship is it's very easy to get misdirected in worship and to begin to worship things that are not God. And we can worship all kinds of things and good things. Some of them are bad and some of them are good. We can worship sports teams. Anyone seen that? We see Brazil lost the World Cup final and a whole lot of people committed suicide. Why? Because their worship is misdirected. We see the elevation of people and fans that are crazy about social influences and influences, and people give their lives and their time and resources towards other people. The world is full of worshipers. We can give ourselves to our work, to our identity. Parents in the room, you can worship your kids. When everything in your life is centered around your kids, you've got to ask yourself the question, am I worshiping my kids? I'm not at all saying don't have activities, don't have hobbies. That's not what I'm saying. Those things are good and they're helpful, but when they become all-consuming in our lives and God takes second or third or fourth or seventh place on the list of priorities in our lives, we've got to ask ourselves the question, what is it that I'm worshiping, and is that thing going to bring me satisfaction? Because the trouble with misdirected worship is that in the end of the day, it's not actually going to bring you the satisfaction that you're looking for. We are created to worship a creator, and when our worship is in the right priority, it's in that place that we find fulfillment and satisfaction. But when our worship is directed to something else, we end up feeling like we just need more, and it's hard to find satisfaction in something that doesn't quite satisfy you. It's easy to get misdirected in worship. And the thing is, about the things that we worship is they form us. So if you think about, let's say, sport. People formed sport, and you begin to worship sport, and then that forms you. So we form things, and then they form us. And this is how it works with worship, is you become like the things that you worship. So if you become a religious worshiper, you may become an extremist because you worship religion. If you worship power, you may become an abuser of people or resources. If you worship money, likely you'll become greedy for that money. If you worship sex, likely you'll become lustful. You become like the things that you worship. So with all that said, what would God say about your worship? Is that too much of a heavy question? Can we move on to the next one? Reflect, think about your life and where you're at. What would God have to say about your worship? Or let me ask you a question in a different way. Do you want to be a better worshiper? I definitely do. I want to be a better worshiper. So we go, well, is there hope? Because I've just had a revelation that, man, there's some things in my life that I've been worshiping, if this is the definition of worship, and I need to make some adjustments, perhaps, because I'm not sure what God would think of my worship. So is there hope? Well, of course there's hope, because when Jesus is in the story, there's always hope. So let's go to John 4 and see when Jesus changed everything about worship. John chapter 4, we'll backtrack to verse 15, just to have a little bit of context in the story. Conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. And the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, and then I'll never be thirsty, and I won't have to keep coming to this well to get water." And Jesus told her, "Go and get your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. So Jesus said to her, you are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you live with now, he's not your husband. What you have said is true. So the woman said, and here comes her evasion, "I can see that you're a prophet. You know all about me." So our people, my people have always worshipped on this mountain. But the Jews, they claim that the place to worship is in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, and here it comes, this is the moment where everything changes. "Woman, believe me, a time is coming when you will not worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know, but we Jews, we worship what we know, because salvation comes from the Jews." And here it is, verse 23. "But the time is coming. In fact, it's now here. The time is now when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." They are the kind of worshipers that the Father is looking for. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship him in spirit and truth. And the woman said, "I know the Messiah is coming." Messiah means Christ, and when he comes, he'll explain everything to us. And Jesus said, "The one you are talking about is the one speaking to you. I am he." And after that, the story carries on. She goes back to the city. The city comes and meets Jesus, and everyone gets saved. And if we just read the story for that, we kind of miss what Jesus is doing, the gravity of what he does, of how everything shifts. So a couple of thoughts on what Jesus does when he changes worship. The first thing that Jesus does is he reveals the Father to us. Jesus himself said, if you want to know what God is like, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If you've ever wondered what God is like, all you have to do is read the stories of Jesus. And that gives a picture of the Father heart of God towards people. And we see in this story this incredible character of Jesus. What he does, he goes out of the cultural way. He does what's inconvenient. He goes into Samaritan territory to meet a social outcast, and he engages her in this most graceful way, but loves her too much to leave her in her place of brokenness and sin. So he confronts the sin and gives her a way out. And it unlocks a city that gets restored. This is the heart of God towards you, is he will go out of his way, he will break cultural barriers and social norms so that he can meet you where you are at in your brokenness and shame, have a conversation with you that addresses the things in your life that needs to change, and show you the way out and lead you into a place of purpose and freedom. That's God's heart towards you. And if you want to know what God is like, if you ever forget, if you're thinking, what is God like, what you got to do is read the stories of Jesus and see how he interacts with people. Because Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So Jesus is the expression of the Father's heart towards us. And one of the ways to cultivate worship in our hearts is to reflect and think about the character and nature of God. So in a story like this, you think, well, wow, Jesus is all-knowing. He knows everything about this woman. And Jesus is all-knowing. He knows everything about you, and he still wants to have a conversation with you. Even that thing that you're thinking about right now, that I hope God doesn't know about that, he knows about it. And he still wants to engage with you. God is holy. It means he's unlike anything else. He's unique. He's completely different. He will do what others don't do to get to you, to reach you. God is sovereign. He's all-powerful. He's absolutely compassionate. He's merciful. He's kind. He's good. He's full of love. He's everywhere, all at the same time. He's incredibly powerful, more than you can begin to imagine. And when you begin to think about these things, I feel it can't help but generate or do something in you where you respond in some kind of sense of awe and go, wow, God is incredible. Matt Redman said that the revelation of God is the fuel for the fire of our worship. When we have a revelation of who God is, how do we do that? We read the stories about Jesus. We get a picture of what the Father heart is towards us. That fuels our fire for worship. So if you feel like you're in a place where I'm battling to worship, here's a practical thing, is read the stories about Jesus. That's a catalyst. You get to know Jesus, you have a picture of God that does something in your heart, and it fuels your fire for worship. A.W. Tozer said, what comes into our mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. When you think about God, what comes into your mind? Because that's going to form everything about your life. Worship is as pure or as base, in other words, as high or as low, as the worshiper entertains high or low thoughts of God. In other words, the bigger that your view of God is, the bigger your worship is going to be. But the smaller that your view of God is, the smaller your worship is going to be. And I don't know where we learned it, somewhere along the way, maybe it was Sunday school or something. Some of us, we have this kind of grandpa picture of God. Where he's like this old guy with a beard and maybe a little balding, and he's got the whole world in his hands. And when you think about God, this is what pops into your mind. At least it's been like that for me sometimes. I have this like disconnected view of God, that he's somewhere out there, but he's not really here. You know, he's somewhere up there in heaven, and he's busy with other things, and maybe he's sort of grandpa-ish, so he's kind, but he can also be a little bit grumpy. And if we have this view of God, and we keep this view of God, I mean, let's be honest, really, who wants to worship grandpa? But if that's our picture of God, how does that reflect our worship? If this is the image that we have. Or could it be more like you step outside and you look up into the night sky, not here in the city, but like when you go away and there's no light pollution, and you look up and you see the galaxy and you see the stars and you are in awe of, you ever had that moment when you look up at the stars and you're just like, wow. God created that, and he cares about me. And we try to manage this tension between the creator God, but the one who is personal and knows all the details of your life. And how do we do that? Well, they connected in Jesus. Because by him, everything was created that has been created. Yet he became human to meet us where we are at. And it's in that moment of revelation that this God who created everything out there and created me is interested in me. That does something in our hearts that shifts and changes the level of our worship. And if you need a catalyst for that, open your Bible and begin to read the stories of Jesus. Because when you get to know Jesus, you get to know the Father. And as you get to know the Father, a revelation of who God is and how much he cares for you, what happens is your heart begins to respond in worship. So Jesus reveals the Father. And the antidote for idolatry in our lives is simply this. Begin to open your eyes and see the greatness of God. And when you see how great God is, suddenly the idols in your life begin to fall off their thrones. And some of us need to change the perspective of what we have of who God is. Say, okay, we're done with grandpa. We're going to worship the Creator. Jesus reveals the Father. And then Jesus does this incredible thing, and this is where the shift happens, is he relocates the Spirit. And he says to the lady, a time is coming where you won't worship on this mountain, and you won't worship in Jerusalem, but you'll worship the Father in spirit and truth. And to unpack this a little bit, what I mean when I say Jesus relocates the Spirit, up until this time, this is the way that worship worked. Not only with the Israelite people, but in most world religions at the time, is people would go to a place to worship. And the Israelites, they would first go to the tabernacle of Moses in the desert. And then later they would go to the tent of David. And then they would go to the temple of Solomon. And within those places, the tabernacle, the tent, and the temple, there was a place called the Holy of Holies. And that's where the Ark of the Covenant was. And that's where God's presence resided. That's where the Holy Spirit was. So when people wanted to do public worship, what they would do is they would go to that place and they would worship in that place. And this is what the lady is talking about. She's saying, our people said we worship on that mountain, and Jews say you got to go to Jerusalem, to the temple. That's where you got to go worship. And here's a moment where everything changes. And Jesus is like, hold on, time out, lady. Time is coming. It's already here. The time is now. Well, you're not going to go there to worship, and you're not going to go there to worship, but you're going to worship the Father in spirit and truth. And we got to fast forward a little bit to the rest of the New Testament to understand. We see the end of the story of what Jesus is talking about. And Paul unpacks it clearly in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 16. He says, do you not know that you are the temple? And the Spirit of God lives inside of you. And this is absolutely profound. It's the shift from having to go to a place to worship. I go to the temple, I go to a place and I worship there, to suddenly, no, through the cross, Jesus is taking worship from a distance to make it really, really personal, and he's making you into the temple. And he's putting the Spirit inside of you. So the Spirit is not out there somewhere, but the Spirit is with you and in you. So all of you, this is the shift, is you don't have to go somewhere to worship. You are a temple, which means you can worship anytime, anywhere, wherever you go. And Jesus makes a shift. He takes worship from a distance, because in the Old Testament, worship was like you kind of bow down and you worship something from a distance. And now Jesus is going, no, I'm going to put someone in you, and you're going to be the temple, and worship is going to take place wherever you are. So worship, to quote Judson Cornwall again, worship is an always now activity. Worship is not what we do on Sunday mornings. Worship is every moment of your life, if you will lean into it. Worship is in the temple. That hasn't changed. But what's changed is the location of the temple. It's not in a place, but it's in your person. So when you begin to follow Jesus, you become the temple of God. And you know what? God's pretty particular about how his temple is. If you read through the Old Testament, you see all these, like, the temple should be like this. But the thing is, he picked you, and he picked me. It's like, I'll take that temple, and that one, and all of it, just as they are, and I'm going to put my Spirit in that temple. So you are qualified by Jesus to be a temple of the Holy Spirit. You don't have to do anything else or clean your act up. Or so. The Holy Spirit's going to move into your life and do some housekeeping. And that might be a little bit painful. He's going to change some things around, but he picks you already. You're the temple. So you carry worship with you wherever you go, if you will lean into it. I don't know if any of you in the room remember what this is. Anyone have any idea what this is? There's a couple of people in there. Yeah, reverse charges. That's a boarding school thing right there. This, for those of you who don't know, this is a Telcom coin-operated public telephone. So what you do, we've still got coins, not so many, but there are a few coins left. You would take these coins, and you would go to the phone, and you would put the coins in the phone to load credit in it, and then you'd dial a number, and then you would phone home if you were away. So in boarding school, for those of us who went to boarding school, you'll know there's like a couple of these somewhere in the school, and then when it's break time or in between class or whatever, you can go to the phones and you can make a call. But there's always that kid who's there first. And you're like, bro, you got 5 minutes. And they're like 15 minutes later, and they're still talking. And you're waiting in the line, and then the bell rings, and you have to go back to class. You don't get to make the call that you want. So the place of queues was like at the public phone booth. So you would have to go to a place to make a call to speak to anyone that you cared about. And if you didn't have coins, you would phone 0020, reverse charges, and then you would wait for like 30 minutes for someone to answer, and then they would reverse charge to your parents' account or whatever. This wasn't that long ago. It's like 20 years ago. But now you buy these collector's items. And then 2007, we got the smartphone. Who needs a call box anymore? Because when you want to speak to someone, what do? You just pull your phone out, because it goes with you wherever you go. You don't have to go to a place to worship. You can worship wherever you are, any time of your day, any time of the night. You can worship. In fact, you're created to worship. You're invited to worship. You're commanded to worship. You are a worshiper, and you are good at, but who or what are you worshiping? So you go, well, does that mean like I don't need to come to church anymore? I would say, I think you need both. You need to worship wherever you are, and you need to come together to worship with others. But the thing about coming into the room when we get together is the worship of our week should flow into a Sunday morning. Not our Sunday mornings flow into the rest of our week. You see, many of us, we come together on a Sunday and we go, this is my spiritual high point. We're going to worship together. I'm going to get all filled up, and then I'm going to go back into my week. And we hit Monday and like take some of our worship credit away. And by the time we hit Saturday, we're like in the red on worship credit. So we go, I'm going back to church tomorrow to get topped up on my worship. And we, in the moment, we're lifting a slow song. That's worship. And we get filled up and we feel good. And we go back into our week, and the week hits us and our worship runs out again. Anyone with me? Shouldn't it be that because we all worship wherever we are, that our Monday through Saturdays is the place where our worship is? And when we come together on Sunday, what happens is Sunday is a culmination of the worship in our week, when the people of God come together to worship together out of the fullness of their week. So rather than come here on a Sunday to get filled up and go back out there, is rather get filled up out there in worship and bring it together as a celebration on Sundays to worship God together. Wouldn't that change things for us? So your worship should flow from a Monday through Saturday into a Sunday, not from a Sunday into your Monday through Saturday. Like, whoa, hold on. Like, how do we do that? We're going to get to that practically. How do we do that? The mind shift is you've got to recognize that you are the temple, that you don't have to come here to worship. You don't need a worship leader to help you worship. I mean, it's nice, because they can sing nicely, and they can create an atmosphere that leads us into worship. But you don't need a band for you to worship. You don't need someone else to do worship. You are already a worshiper, and you are very, very good at it, because God has created you to worship. To quote Tozer again, he said, if you're not worshiping God on a Monday like the way you did before, perhaps you're not worshiping Him at all. Like, he's pretty direct. If you want some direct stuff, read Tozer. Like, he doesn't hold back. If you're not worshiping God on a Monday the way that you did on Sunday morning, perhaps you're not worshiping Him at all. Is there somewhere in your mind, in your heart, this idea that you have to go to church to worship, and that those 2 hours on Sunday, that's worship, and the rest of the week, well, that's life? Could it be that your worship and your life are connected? Well, that's what Jesus says. You're the temple, so you worship wherever you go. So Jesus reveals the Father, and that inspires our worship. And Jesus relocates the Spirit from a place into a person. That person is you. As you begin to follow Jesus, He brings worship near through the cross. And the last thing is, and we'll close with this, is that the Father is looking for worshipers. I found that really interesting as I was reading through it. Jesus says, you won't worship on that mountain, you won't worship in Jerusalem, but you'll worship in spirit and truth. The Father's looking for worshipers. These worshipers must worship Him in spirit and truth. These are the people, these are the worshipers that the Father is looking for. You know what I love about that is God is not looking for worship, but He's looking for worshipers. God is not like egotistical. It's like, hey, everybody worship me. I deserve it. Give me your worship. Sometimes we have this idea of God just wants our worship. He deserves our worship, of course. He's the creator of the universe. In fact, let me read you a quote from Matthew Henry, a Bible commentator. He said, God is our creator. He's the author of our being. We must kneel before the Lord our Maker. Idolaters kneel before gods which they themselves have made, but we kneel before God who made us, who made the world, and who is therefore our rightful proprietor. For his we are, and not our own. So there's definitely, unquestionably, this element, this thought that yes, God deserves our worship, but God is not looking for worship, but he's looking for worshipers. See, worship is an attitude before it's an action. Worship is a heart attitude before it's something that we do. Worship is something that happens inside of us. So when you lift your hands on a Sunday, you got to ask yourself, is there a heart behind my hands being lifted? Is my heart in this? Or am I just doing this because someone on stage said, lift your hands for Jesus? It's like, why are you doing that? Is it because there's a heart inside of you that goes, God, I just want to lift my hands up to you because there's something inside of me that I just don't know what else to do with my hands right now. So I'm just lifting my hands to you. Or do you feel compelled? I have to lift my hands. And in church we can be funny. There's all kinds of hand lifts. There's like these ones, and these, side to side. And you stick around church for a while and you start to name all the moves. Like, why do we do that? Is it because we've got groupthink and you look at the person next to you and one hand, two hands, and we're so focused on the outside action and we're not paying attention, I think, to what's going on in our hearts. And Jesus said, you know what, there's people who worship me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. I'm not looking for that worship. That's just the actions. What I'm looking for is the attitude of the heart. So is there a heart under your hands? When you sing, is your spirit in the song, or you're just reading the words off the screen and saying them you're not feeling anything inside? God's not looking for that kind of worship. I mean, could you imagine if you went out, you guys have just got engaged. Could you imagine, Fran, if Ben took you on a date and you sat down at the table and it's romantic and candles and all these things and you're like, wow, this is amazing. This is my fiance, future together. You're dreaming about that. And he pulls out a book of scripted words that someone else has written. And then he begins to read, he looks deeply into your eyes, friend. And then he begins to read you someone else's words. He said, I just think that you're the most beautiful thing. And I love your blue eyes. And Fran doesn't have blue eyes. But he's reading someone else's words. How do you worship God? Do you take the words of someone else and you just read them to him? Do you take something else someone said about God and say, well, I'm just going to read that because, God's looking for worship? No, God's not looking for worship. He's looking for worshipers whose heart is in it. The lines of that song we're going to say it just now. This is the question I have for you. Is there a lion inside of those lungs? Or are you just reading the lines off a screen? Is there a heart under your hands? Is there a spirit in your song? Is there prayer in your praise? Or are you just proclaiming what someone else has said? This is what it means to worship in spirit, is to let your spirit come alive in worship, because you see, God is spirit. And the way that the spirit connects with you is through your spirit. So when your spirit is in us, I've said this before, but let me say it again. The word enthusiastic, it means in theos, God's theos, spirit inside of you. When you're enthusiastic, it's your spirit coming alive. When you worship God, is your spirit in it? And you worship him in truth. What does that mean? It means be yourself. It means be true to who you are. It means be who God has created you to be. It means if you feel like lifting your hands, lift your hands. If you don't feel like lifting your hands, if that's not you, then don't lift your hands. But worship in spirit and in truth. Don't pretend. Don't perform. Don't be like somebody else. Don't copy. God has created you to be his temple. As you are, he's put his spirit inside of you. Your spirit connects with his spirit. Something comes alive as an expression of adoration to God, because you think of how big he is, and you look at the stories of Jesus and you go, wow, God, you do that for me. And something comes alive in you and you begin to worship. And the lion inside of your lungs begins to come out. God is looking for worshipers. And as I was preparing, I thought, well, God, why are you looking for worshipers? Is it because you're like your grandpa and you can't remember where you put them? Where are those worshipers gone? Like, aren't you all knowing? Like, I'm kidding, but go with me on this, because that's how my mind works. Is like, God, why are you looking for worshipers? What's the reason behind it? It's definitely not because you don't know where they are, because you know everything. So why would you say that? And I think it's because there's something in worship that is there for us. And it's God's desire that we would become worshipers, because something is going to change when we become worshipers. And here's what changes, is when you begin to worship, heaven arrives. Because it says in Psalm 22 verse 3 that God is enthroned on the praises of his people. So when his people praise, God is put on the throne. When he's on the throne, what happens? His kingdom comes. What's his kingdom? Righteousness, peace, and joy. His will comes. What's his will? Good, pleasing, and perfect. So when the people of God worship, they put him on the throne, and what comes? Righteousness, peace, joy, good, pleasing, perfect. Things change when you worship. So worship is not subject to a place. But if you take your worship into a place, things will change. Why? Because you put God on the throne, and his rule and reign comes, and things change. In Acts 16, Paul and Silas are put in prison. In the middle of the night, they begin to worship God. And the next thing that happens, the prison walls break open. Their chains fall off, and freedom comes. So when you begin to worship in spirit and truth, what happens is it changes the atmosphere and environment and circumstances around you. So if you want to see change in your life, if you want to see God move, all you got to do is learn how to become a worshiper. And you begin to worship him, his rule and reign comes, heaven breaks loose, and things change in your life. And I think this is why it is that God is looking for worshipers, not because like everyone must worship me, is because, hey church, when you begin to worship, heaven's going to come. And my heart is that heaven comes and the kingdom moves forward, and there's healing and there's freedom and there's purpose. So begin to worship, learn how to worship. Jesus reveals the Father, and Jesus relocates the Spirit from a place out there to a person in here, and the Father is looking for worshipers. And it's not an action, but it's an attitude. And you can worship however you want, however God has created you to be. But the thing to remember is worship actions look the same on the outside. I don't know which one, who wants to eat these apples? Anyone? This is not the Genesis 3 apple, probably wasn't an apple anyway, but anyone want to have a bite? Which one? You'll have an apple. Peter wants the one on the right. This is your one. There we go. Have a bite to that. Chester, have a bite to that. This thing's plastic. Chester, you got the real apple. Chester's munching on that one. This, but they both look like apples. What does your worship look like? Is it just something on the outside? Or is there something going on in the inside? Why don't you stand to your feet? Throw me your apple, bud. Let's just show everyone. Well, I'll give it back. It's a real apple, this one. What does your worship look like? Is it just something on the outside, or is there something of substance underneath? The way to get substance in your worship, have a revelation of who Jesus is. Begin to think about what God has done for you. And as that happens, let the Spirit come alive in you and sing and shout and dance and lift your hands and do whatever God has created you to be. Take your worship wherever you go, into your home, into your boardrooms, into your classrooms. Begin to worship God in spirit and truth. Prison walls will break, chains will fall off, light will come, people will find Jesus, the kingdom of heaven will move forward. It's time to learn how to be a church that worships, not just the action of worship, but to learn how to be worshipers.